Hello, everyone. First, I just sort of want to thank everyone for being here and listening to this talk. It's been a very long day. A lot of people are jet lagged and tired, but you guys are still here, so I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Today, I'm going to touch on something that is a bit different to what us at Cause and Effects usually do. We usually don't touch a lot of virtual production at all. So this was kind of new to us, but I sort of just wanted to share what that process would look like and just sort of the challenges that we ran into and some of the things that we discovered. So today I'm going to talk about how we used Solaris and Karma XPU to render massive resolutions. The largest resolution media we rendered for this was about 27K. So it's a lot of pixels that need to be rendered. But first, who am I? I'm Mikael. People usually just call me Michael because it's easier. I am the lead CG technical artist at Cause and Effects. I spend most of my time just doing pipeline development, really. But sometimes I end up doing sort of R&D projects that come in. And those are usually projects that sort of dive into something that we don't usually do and sort of raises challenges that we haven't dealt with before and we need to figure it out. So that's one of the things that I'm going to talk about today. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit about Cause and Effects and who we are and what we do. And we are a visual effects company. We're based in Auckland, New Zealand. And we are a pretty small company. I would say we're usually around 50 people in total. When we get really busy, we sort of scale up towards 70, sometimes more people. But yeah, it's definitely not like a massive team by any chance. So we do have to get a little bit creative sometimes. And yeah, that's usually just when it gets more fun, isn't it? To sort of see how we tackle these issues. And we primarily specialize in episodic TV and feature film work. So usually, just the classic sort of like smaller studio type work for film and media. These challenges was new for us, and it was definitely sort of a fun issue. So I'm just going to show a little bit of the work we do and some breakdowns, just so that you sort of get an impression of the work that we usually do. So yeah. Yeah, you can sort of get sort of an impression of the type of work we usually do. It's just, feature film, episodic TV type work. Probably some of the more notable things is we worked on Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power, which was a massive TV series. We were definitely the smallest VFX studio to work on that project. So, when you're a small studio, you're sort of expected to punch above your weight. And that's sort of, I guess, the theme of today's talk as well, is sort of like how Houdini has allowed us to sort of punch above our weight and sort of like work on some of these sort of more higher budget and big projects. But today, specifically, I'm going to talk about some large format content that we did, which, as you can see, it's not really the type of work we usually do. So there's a lot of challenges that came with it. I'm going to talk about 2 projects today that sort of just randomly came in at the same time. And we just accepted them both because they were both sort of like in the same virtual production realm. The unfortunate thing is that I'm not actually able to show the final product of those 2 projects, but I'm allowed to show all of the R&D work that went into it. And if you ask me, sometimes that's the fun part. So, at least I can show that. And both of these projects were, we were using Solaris and Karma XPU for both of them. And we really discovered a couple of things that we didn't really expect, that we were surprised by. I thought that was worth sharing. So the first project specifically, it was a deliverable for an LED wall. You can see the delivery specs there, which is a lot of pixels. Horizontally, it was 27,720 pixels by 3,000 pixels tall. It was a full 1 minute shot that needed to be loopable. So 1,440 frames. So we were looking to render about 122 billion pixels for this one shot. Which is a lot and not something that we usually do. We are sort of one of those studios where when the comp department tells us to render something in OpenGate or UHD, we usually say, maybe let's render it half res, because it might take a little bit too long. So this was sort of completely out of our scope and sort of out of our realm. So we definitely had to get creative with this one. On the bottom right there, you can see a top-down view of what the actual LED wall looked like. So it's pretty much a 300-degree field of view. So basically the entire deliverable is a media where you can basically see behind the camera, which is not something that we've done before. And Karma helped us solve this in kind of a creative way. So that was kind of fun. That sort of gives you sort of an impression of the first project. The second project was arguably more demanding. Here we were looking at a deliverable of 12K by 12K squared. This was for a massive LED wall as well. This wall was over 100 meters tall. So the client was they very specifically told us, you're not allowed to do any upscaling whatsoever. This has to be rendered natively because the wall that it was going to be shown on was so massive that any type of upscaling you did would be noticed. So, that was a bit terrifying, but, we managed to get there. So it first started out with a brainstorming session and probably a brainstorm panic session because all of us sort of freaked out after the client meetings. Hearing what the actual deliverables were. And in the studio, we do a fair bit of pre- and post-production work. So we do use Unreal Engine quite a bit. So our first thought was basically, all right, this has to be done in Unreal Engine. There's no other way we're going to be able to do this because how else are we going to be able to pump out that many pixels in such a short amount of time? We actually didn't end up doing it in Unreal Engine, and I will talk a little bit about why later. But just to touch a little bit on sort of Houdini's journey through cause and effects is cause and effects started with Maya and V-Ray as their primary packages. And then we switched to Houdini using Redshift in 2020. It was initially met with a lot of skepticism because everyone has the sort of idea that Houdini is super complicated and there's no way sort of a smaller team is going to be able to tackle such a complex piece of software while being able to be profitable. So yeah, but it was basically a couple of us freelancers that had our Houdini in the licenses, and we were playing with Houdini at home, having fun, doing sort of like fun personal projects, and we really saw the power of it. And the more and more we started using it personally, the more and more we sort of pushed for it. So eventually, we just couldn't stop talking about it. So I think it got a bit annoying eventually, because people got tired of hearing the phrase, this would have been much easier to do in Houdini. So eventually someone made the forbidden software swear jar, where every time someone mentioned the word Houdini, you had to put $1 in. And we did actually have quite a bit of funds in that bucket eventually. But yeah, eventually they caved. We got a project that sort of aligned with it made sense to use Houdini. So we decided, hey, let's try it out. And it definitely became a huge success. And it's really helped us sort of scale up our work. And it's really helped us sort of like getting these bigger projects that we wouldn't necessarily be able to do otherwise, and really punching above our weight in terms of the size we are. Yeah. So this is basically how our rendering pipeline started out. It was fairly basic. We basically everyone was working in Houdini in their HIP files. And then we're using Deadline as our render manager. So everyone would just submit their HIP files to Deadline, just using the standard Houdini Deadline plugin, which ships with Deadline. And that was pretty much the reason why we were using it. It's already out of the box. It's ready to go. But this ended up sort of causing some challenges for us. If you use the native Deadline plugin that comes with, or the native Houdini plugin that comes with Deadline, it basically runs a Houdini Python session that opens up, or that uses Houdini engine to open up your HIP file and then start rendering. The biggest issue with this is that you require a Houdini engine license for every single computer on the farm that needs to render. And Houdini engine licenses are not cheap, especially if you want to time it by the amount of computers you want to use for rendering. So that's been one of the big pushes that we've had this year, because we've really pushed the use of Solaris and USD and Karma inside of a studio. So yeah, that's been basically one of the sort of like biggest changes for us. And this is a very, very simplified summary of what our current rendering pipeline looks like. So everyone works in Solaris, and we have a bunch of HDAs for convenience that sort of helps us, with the whole USD structure. I'm not going to dive too deep into that, but we're still using Deadline for our render manager, but we're basically submitting USD files to Deadline now. We have our own custom written Deadline plugin that uses Husk instead of Houdini engine. And for the people who don't know what Husk is, it's basically a super, super simple command line tool that ships with Houdini. And the only thing that it does is that you can give it a USD file, and it can render with any Hydra delegate that you give it. And the best thing about this is that it doesn't use a Houdini engine license. So this is basically one of the biggest factors also for us to be actually able to render this thing as well. Because we do have a fair bit of machines in our studio, but there's no way we had enough funds to pay for a Houdini engine license to have across like all of those computers. So Husk will only use a render license if you use it. So if you are running Husk, give it a USD file. And if you're using Karma to render, it will only use a Karma license. And I believe if you buy either a core or an FX license with a yearly maintenance, I think you get 10 Karma licenses with that purchase. And in total, we have about 10 Houdini licenses. So that meant that we had 100 render licenses to utilize. And this was probably the biggest factor that made us actually be able to render this thing. So yeah, we have a total of, I think, around 70 machines in the studio. We have some dedicated render nodes, but most of the farm capacity in our studio is just artist machines that's just sitting there overnight and basically not doing anything. So that was that was quite an important factor in this entire project. And a little bit about why Karma specifically in 20.5 sort of checked all the boxes for us. in allowing us to do this project. Well, first of all, I can touch a little bit about why Unreal Engine didn't actually work out for this. We did a bunch of tests with these resolutions in Unreal Engine. And basically, when you render something that's so high resolution, it requires so much memory just to keep track of all of the pixels and all the calculations that need to happen. Even Unreal Engine struggled with these resolutions. The other downside of it is that we don't really have a way of distributing Unreal Engine renders. Like, we do sometimes run renders from Unreal Engine just, on a separate machine that just lets it render out and spit out frames so it doesn't slow down like artists' work. But there's no way to distribute it, or that we have set up at least, to distribute it across multiple machines. That still made that if we do render a full minute's worth of material, that still needs to render on one machine, and we need to wait until that one machine is done. And that machine could always crash, restart, and queue the render again. So we also had a fair bit of issues when it came to, like, we had done most of our layouts and stuff in Solaris, as we usually do. We had some difficulty trying to bring it all back into Unreal because we wanted to basically assign materials and stuff in Unreal so that we can do all the material work there, so we don't have to jump back and forth. But the USD support in Unreal is still fairly beta. There's a fair bit of limitations there. So we basically ended up spending, I think, almost 4 weeks just banging our heads against the wall trying to get it working in Unreal. And then eventually we sort of said, we should just try it in Karma, just see how it goes. Karma actually checked a lot of the boxes, and specifically the release with 20.5. The biggest one was the lens shader. And you can probably imagine why we needed the lens shader. It's because specifically the LED wall that had a 300-degree field of view, there's no other way to render it than with a lens shader. You can't really have a lens that goes beyond 180 degrees, doesn't really work. And then we had all of the other convenience things that we use in our pipeline, like deep cryptomats and all of the standard AOVs that we use. The compers are always happy when you give them the AOVs that you want. And we want to keep our compers happy, So, and then light instancing as well. And the clone control panel as well is amazing if anyone hasn't played with it. It's basically a way in Solaris to not having to render Karma itself just in the viewport. You can actually get it off to render directly to the render gallery, which in this project, you'll see why, but it ended up being super helpful. And then the last thing that I'm going to touch on today is tiled rendering, which was a big key to how we managed to do this. So first step was to do some basic tests. And this was one of the first tests that we did on our farm. This render specifically is rendered 12 by 12K, so it's around 144 million pixels per image. And Karma somehow managed to render it in a reasonable amount of time. This was just super basic proof of concept. We just took a bunch of kit bash assets that we had lying around, ran them through a TOPS network just to make them into standardized USD assets, scattered them around in the city. And then a big part of this as well was also just trying the lens shader and making sure that it could actually output whatever we expected and whatever the client expected as well. And once we had done this, we got asked, how far can we push it? So obviously, we needed to try the same scene with a fog box and instance lights that randomly change color. So I queued this render on a Friday, just to let it go over the weekend. And I woke up on Saturday from a call from our infrastructure manager, Ruben. He basically said that Greg, who's the managing director for the company, had come into the studio on Saturday morning, and he said that something felt slightly off. So he opened the door to the studio, and he basically just got hit with a wall of heat. And this is what happened. If you look at the graph on the right side there, that is the temperature in our computer room when we queued that render. It went up to an internal temperature in the room of 4 degrees Celsius. That's what happens when you suddenly queue and start. Because remember, XPU is both CPU and GPU going at once. It's a lot of heat and a lot of power that gets pushed through these through those machines. So yeah, after that we had to get another AC unit. So sorry, Greg. But yeah, it definitely helped us. And then the second part of it was to test the lens shader. This is the actual format of that first project that we talked about. It's a 9:1 aspect ratio. And this is also a quick scene that I just made sure that, it could actually be rendered. And what better way to just scatter a bunch of rubber toys in space floating. I think it was quite poetic. But you can basically see how the lens distortion performs. So it looks a bit weird, but basically what this is just a bunch of objects moving towards camera. So what you see on the left and right side is actually behind us. And that's why you sort of get this weird looking distortion with the lens shader where everything comes towards the camera and then it looks like it starts moving towards the sides. But basically what that is just moving behind us. And this can be very disorienting when you're working, especially with layouts. If you're looking at it like this, you don't really know, it's like suddenly everything that is behind you is also visible and you don't even know what you're looking at. And, in the viewport, you can't really visualize this. So the only way to do it is to render it. So a key part of this as well was to make the actual geometry of the wall that we were delivering to. So this is that wall. We made a simple piece of geometry and just made UVs for it. And the best way for us to sort of like check what our renders look like was to just use or play it back on that geometry, just to sort of like see that this distortion was working as we expected and that it didn't look all weird. But you can sort of see here that the rubber toys on the right side there, they're actually moving as you would expect. They're moving past us. But technically, the camera would be sort of in the center there and doing the projection. So yeah, it's working like we intended. And there's no way we could do that without the lens shader and that being supported in Karma XPU in 20.5. This was really the only way we could review this type of media. It's definitely a better way than what Chris, who's the head of the CG department, suggested, because he suggested that I try to put the eyes at the side of my head. Really poor suggestion. And this sort of stuff can also be very disorienting. So we made this, which I sort of just call the orientation cube or the mapping cube. Because when you're working with lens shaders, you don't really know what you're looking at anymore. You can look at your camera in the viewport, it's pointing towards a thing, but the camera is just seeing so much more. So this is a 180-degree fisheye lens. And I sort of just made a box and I put a texture on each of the faces, just indicating which axes it's pointing in. So I was working on this for an entire day, and I was basically dizzy at the end of the day because it's super disorienting and you don't really know what you're looking at anymore. Yeah, so sort of probably what this talk should have been called is just the battle against VRAM. Because when you need to pump that much data in and out of a GPU, there is a lot of things you need to be careful of. And then, the obvious things that you need to watch out for, and the sort of the biggest things that we burn ourselves on with Karma XPU was that you always need to be using tile textures. It's very important. Karma XPU does this by default. Always make sure your NVIDIA drivers are up to date. And then always just make sure that you are being clean with your USD data, not pushing too many attributes or prim bars through Karma. And another important thing as well is to use proxy purposes whenever you're working in the viewport, because you really, really need to maintain sort of all of that VRAM that you can. And then the last thing is basically how we accomplish all of this is tiled rendering. So if you try to render a frame in Karma at the 12 by 12K resolution, it will most likely just crash, just straight away, even if you try to just render a plane. The reason for this is basically just to store that much data of that many pixels. It takes so much memory to store that into the GPU and manage to do all of those calculations. So the way to do it is to do tiled rendering, which is basically you can just tell each computer to just render a section of the image, and at the end you just stitch it all together. Which luckily for us is something that Husk, which is what I mentioned earlier, is sort of that what we're using for rendering, supports by default. So when you're rendering with Husk, you can specify a X and Y amount of tiles that you want to render. So this is just a couple of flags that you sort of put into the command line version. The Houdini or the USD render op as well has this built in with a little checkbox over there. So you can basically just tell it, I want to render this amount of tiles in Y and this amount of tiles in X, and then that will be sort of split up across multiple computers. So yeah, this was the way that we ended up doing it. Houdini also ships with a utility that is called iTileStitch, which basically is just super simple command line tool that you just give it all of the tiles that you rendered, and then it will just output a stitched together version of that image so that you don't have to do it yourself. We just basically ended up making a top network that just did all of this for us, so just so that we can sort of like quickly see the images sort of like combine it after it was done rendering. And then also just keep your USD data clean. It's very important when you're rendering such high resolution stuff. You always want to be careful with time dependencies in USD, just to make sure you're not storing sort of any unnecessary USD data and pushing that through to Karma, because it will really, really sort of like stack up with the amount of memory that it uses. And yeah, just make sure, be careful with time dependencies. Like there's certain things you don't have to animate, like if your UVs are static, for example, just make that a default value in USD so you don't store all that extra data. A thing as well that we played a lot with was denoising, because we weren't technically allowed to upscale anything. We thought, all right, what if we render it at lower samples, but then later we tried to denoise it. And luckily, Karma ships with the NVIDIA and Intel denoisers out of the box. The problem, though, when you are doing tiled rendering is that because each machine is rendering a tile just by itself, it's not aware of what's next to it. So when it denoises the image, you'll basically end up with this very subtle seams because you want to denoise the entire image together and not separately. So what we ended up doing is that we ended up sort of combining the images with OpenImageIO or iTileStitch, and then you can run the denoising later, which Houdini ships with a utility for as well, which is called iDenoise. It's basically the same thing as the Karma render settings options has, but it's just a command line tool that you can run it afterwards if you want to, or, and then you can specify which AOVs that you want to do. We also ended up rendering this in deep, which didn't really help us at all. For those who don't know what deep is, it's basically that you render out your images with depth data, because we wanted to split it out into different render layers so that we can stitch it together in comp. The thing that Karma does that's a bit special is Karma doesn't actually calculate the distance from the camera origin to the object. What it does is that it calculates the distance from the camera plane itself. And this caused some issues for us because we were rendering images where you could see more than 180 degrees. So basically it meant that the closer objects was to the camera plane, the less accurate the deep data became. But we managed to sort of get some help. We figured out a way around this. And you can sort of see on the right side there, it's how Mantra renders out deep data. And then on the left there is how Karma does it. Mantra does sort of like what we would expect and calculate the distance from the camera origin itself. But Karma, you can sort of see those two black lines there. That's basically where the camera plane itself intersects. And this is just a tube just wrapped around the camera and just rendered the deep data. You can sort of see that it ends up going to 0, where sort of the camera plane meets, and that caused a lot of issues for us. Luckily, we got some help from some friends, Peter Jansen and Oliver Daniels, and they helped us do some hacky deep angles things in Nuke and managed to get around this. Side Effects has also said that they're going to look into possibly adjusting this in a next major release. But yeah, this is sort of a niche edge case. And because I wasn't actually allowed to show the final product today, unfortunately, If anyone is keen to seeing how it actually turned out, we usually do sort of case studies where we sort of just write quick articles about the projects that we've done. So if you're keen, probably maybe next year at some point, you can always check in at the website and see how it all turned out. Yeah, and then that was everything for me. Thank you so much.
Very cool walkthrough on something that's much less common in the Houdini world. Very cool use case. Any questions? Yeah.
Did you, really well done, it was really nicely done.
Yeah,
good,
thank you.
Good to see that case study. Did you manage to test the tile rendering in Unreal at all?
We didn't, no. We'd spent already so much time trying to push it in Unreal. We sort of just reached a point where we just said we just need to get something out. And we never really got the time to try it. We never got the time to try tile rendering in Unreal. So I don't really know how that impacts like VRAM usage, for example. And we also never got the chance to really play with lens shaders either. So that's something that we're also keen on sort of like playing with, because we might get other projects that are like this as well. And there's definitely other projects that are more suitable in Unreal for sure that Karma probably wouldn't be able to render for sure. Yeah. Yeah, good question.
Yeah, also, you mentioned in your old pipeline used Redshift as your render.
Yep.
How did that sort of compare regarding to speed?
So in terms of speed, we did a bunch of tests in Redshift kind of early on, but we did them at lower resolution. What we found with Redshift is that usually once you go that high resolution, Redshift just stops. And this is sort of the reason why we had the big push to Karma as well, is that we have experienced sort of a lot of hard limits with Redshift, where, the scenes that we've done have become more and more complex, because we're working on bigger projects. And eventually you just get to the point where there's just no more VRAM left. Like we have a fair bit of 4090s in our facility, 24 gigs of VRAM, and even those cards haven't been able to render some of the scenes that we have been able to do. So the good thing about Karma, I guess, is that if you reach that hard limit, you could either stick with XPU, which if the GPU fails, it will fall back to CPU, obviously, but you can always just switch back to CPU and just render it. It's just going to take longer. That's been one of our biggest reasons as well, to sort of push away for Redshift, because it doesn't really sort of keep up with our demands anymore, unfortunately. Yeah.
Nice, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you just have some advice to share about you're using the NVIDIA denoiser? Did you do any benchmarking? Were you able to see whether a certain amount of denoising compared to a certain amount of sampling worked? Did you try the Intel denoiser at all?
We did, yeah. And I guess the biggest difference, I didn't do a ton of comparisons, but I guess the biggest difference that we found is that, and as far as I'm aware, the NVIDIA one pretty much have temporal awareness. So you can feed it either a velocity map, and then I think you can also feed it a previous frame as well. So sometimes if you have sort of like one of the animations that I showed, which is that city where the camera just moves through and it's a lot of motion, the NVIDIA one will really struggle with that, because it's sort of like that awareness between the frames that the Intel one sort of struggles with, because it has basically no temporal sort of like awareness at all. But we sort of set a rule that if your base sort of like noise level is acceptable and not completely outrageous, then denoising works pretty well. Just stuff like removing fireflies, then usually you isolate it just to the specular path so that you don't kill the detail of your beauty and that kind of stuff. So yeah, it sort of varies. And it's pretty easy as well to just like with that iDenoise utility, just to try both. Because you don't necessarily need to do it while you queue off the render and stick to one. You can always just run the iDenoise utility later and just try both of them. So yeah, definitely different use cases for sure. But yeah, good question though.
Cool, thanks.
Were you seeing this and thinking spatial visualization too? Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Hey, just curious on your lens shader and whether or not it was just a straight cylindrical projection or if it was actually custom for the shape of your geometry of the LED screen.
This was surprisingly just a polar projection. The cylindrical projection doesn't really do what I expected it to, which I still have yet to figure out why. But yeah, no, this is just a polar projection. And when you use a polar projection, it will automatically do a full 360, which is not what we wanted to do. We wanted just 300 degrees and then just crop it top and bottom. And basically how I did that is that I just used that geometry of the wall as a reference and just had Karma running live while adjusting parameters. And I just basically used the, you can adjust the sort of sensor size live and crop it. So I just did a full polar projection and basically just cropped the sides and top and bottom. And then we got that sort of like, that spec that I was using. But that's why just having the geometry of the wall there was super helpful, because I actually had a reference of like, this is the actual size that it needs to be, and this is the field of view that we need. And yeah, the client was super happy with it as well. We did initially try a 3 or 4 camera split setup, right? We would just have 4 cameras just pointing in each direction, but you're always suffering from the seam. We had one of our hero objects in the middle of 2 cameras, and it just it was a straight object, and then it just ended up looking like this. So it didn't really work out. So that's when the lens shader actually came in super handy. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Instead of moving the eyes to the side of your head, have you tried VR?
Good question. We actually sort of got promised by one of our clients to send us a VR headset. And Paul Dixon, who was the supervisor for this project, he got very frustrated because he basically always had to review it on a flat screen. So whenever he got frustrated, he would scream, "Goggles, goggles!" So basically someone just bring him a VR headset so that he can look around at it. And one of our clients actually had a custom built piece of software that you could basically just bring a MOV into the software, and it just sort of projected it on sort of like how it would actually look on the wall. And then they said, you could use a VR headset if you wanted to. In the meantime, we sort of just ended up using the geometry for a bit, and then also just we had a bunch of SD maps that we had in Nuke, just to sort of like basically try to visualize it there. It would 100% be super helpful to have a VR headset. And it would be kind of funny to see everyone sitting in the review room with VR goggles on, just like looking around. And for sure.
You mentioned that you really should update your NVIDIA driver. Any specific reason why?
So if you look at the Karma documentation, it says a very specific version that I think it's version 5.5.5, especially with the 4090s. In a lot of cases, you basically just uses more of the architecture of the card itself. And it's just stability in general. We were on sort of old NVIDIA drivers, and there was constant crashes all the time. And it was just that stability. And then also, once you go above a certain version, I think it's 5.5, then you start seeing a lot of just speed increases as well, just because NVIDIA, I guess, has done some things that allows Karma to basically use more of the architecture of the card and that kind of stuff. But it's also sort of a fine balance, because there is currently one of the more recent NVIDIA drivers that just basically brings out a lot of bugs in Karma. So you basically, it's this battle of just finding the version that works for you and just sticking with it and just not updating, basically.
Yeah, that would have been my second question. Have you considered pick a good version of the driver for production?
We're still looking for it, honestly. It's
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's just trying a bunch of versions, but I mean, side effects is also usually pretty good in the forums as well, to highlight when there are sort of versions that doesn't really work well with Karma. So usually it's a good idea. Just look on the forums, just see if they made some announcements about stay away from this version, and then you just go from there. But yeah, it's definitely a battle, just finding the version. Yeah, for sure.
Maybe one more question? Or not? Awesome. Thanks, Michael.
We're good. Thank you.